These are the best wildlife zooms ever made. The Canon 200-800, look at that. The Sony 200-600, you can see we actually use this one because it's wrapped up in camo. There's legacy with these lenses. The Sony 200-600 was the best zoom lens ever made in our recent comparison. But then after Canon launched the 200-800, we found it to be just a tiny bit better in image quality, not in handling. But now, Sony introduces their 400-800. Not the same zoom range, though it does also go out to 800, but it has some real advantages over the Canon. And is it better than the 200-600, which has been so great for so long? I'm gonna test these and tell you. No sponsorships, I just want you to get the best gear. First, we'll talk about the handling. The Sony 200-800 here, it's big and heavy, but when you zoom it, well, it zooms easily and it does not change length. Chelsea and I often shoot from a kayak, so not having the length change actually makes things much more stable. It also means you can zoom a lot quicker, but it only has a 2x zoom. If you compare this lens against the Sony 200-600, you can see it's a little bit longer and it's also a little bit heavier, but it goes out to 800mm instead of just 600mm. The Canon 200-800 covers the range of both of these, kind of gives you everything. But they had to make some compromises. Like when you zoom, you can see it has to sort of trombone out. And well, it takes actually a lot of work to get it zoomed out. Shooting this on a kayak, yeah, it means I had to sort of lean back with my body every time I zoomed in and out. And sometimes I couldn't zoom in quite fast enough. And this is the smoothest zoom setting. So when it comes to design, the two Sonys are better. But how do they do for sharpness? Well, we already know the Sony 200-600 isn't quite as sharp when you have to go all the way to 800mm. There, the Canon's extra length wins. Not completely obvious, because sometimes you can crop a 600mm lens and it will outperform an 800mm lens. But here the Canon is better. Let's compare the sharpness of all three of these lenses in a controlled environment and the real world. It's cold in Connecticut, but here's the only bird I could find. You can see the 800mm is a little tighter, but we can fix that with cropping, so let's match the zoom. Zoomed way in, the 800mm lens does show a little bit more detail. It's not a huge difference, but it is there. The 800mm also has a little bit better background blur and a little bit less noise, since after cropping, the aperture is just a tiny bit faster. First, a test chart. Can we crop the 600 to look as good as the 800? No, not quite. The 800mm definitely looks better than the 600 cropped to 800mm. Comparing the sharpness of the Canon 200-800 against the Sony 400-800 at their long end at 800, the Sony is just the tiniest bit crisper. I want to call it a tie, but it's a very narrow win for Sony. Okay, but what if you already have the Sony 200-600? Could you get a 1.4 or 2x teleconverter and have it outperform this 200-800? Let's take a look. If we put a 1.4 times teleconverter on the 200-600, you can see the focal lengths match pretty closely. But how's the sharpness? We do get more sharpness out of the 200-600 with the teleconverter, but it still doesn't match the 800mm lens. Even with a 2x teleconverter, I'm getting better results out of the 400-800 without the teleconverter. If you are getting this 400-800, should you get a teleconverter for it? Sometimes teleconverters add detail, but not always. So let's take a look at the results. Adding a teleconverter to the 200-800 does work, but does not produce more detailed images, at least with a 50 megapixel camera. Thus, I wouldn't bother with a teleconverter. Okay, so which lens should you get? If you aren't already invested in either Canon or Sony, I think it's pretty much a draw. I like the Canon 200-800. The sharpness is great, but the handling's not as good as the Sony. For me, I'm gonna stick with my Sony Alpha 1, soon to be Alpha 1 Mark II whenever they start shipping. But I am gonna buy the 400-800 here. It's perfect for wildlife. And compared to the Canon, I do lose that 200-400mm range. But looking back at my wildlife pictures, it's not often that I need to zoom back past 400mm, because I mostly do birds, because I'm in Connecticut and we don't really have any big wildlife. And thus, that sort of close range isn't useful to me. I'm not giving much up by losing 200-400. If I were, then I would probably get the 200-600. If you're doing bigger game, or if you tend to get closer, the 200-600 will be better. But if you're shooting birds faraway things where you can never quite get close enough, the Sony 400-800 is the best wildlife lens in the world right now, and we have tested them all. Check our previous videos. I'm absolutely gonna order the 400-800 for myself, and I'm gonna wrap it up in one of these camo wraps so it doesn't look so bright and white. In the comments down below, let me know what you think. If you like unsponsored, quick, to-the-point reviews, subscribe, give me a like, I could use the support. And don't forget to check out our photography education at Northrup.photo. Stunning Digital Photography has been the #1 best-selling, award-winning photography book, and of course it covers wildlife photography. We have books on post-processing, Lightroom, Lightroom Classic, Photoshop, and they all include videos. They all include sample files. I'm a different type of author. I don't expect you just to read. I want you to learn hands-on. I want you to have videos, and all of our training provides all of that. Thanks for watching. Bye.